Hi everyone from FCS. This is Rylee. You are here delivering the first part of Jocelyn Garcia and I's presentation on design for the disabled. Since we were both super interested in different kinds of disabilities, we decided to just make it easier and do two separate overviews. There may be some interesting overlapping in a few places, but for the most part, it's crazy how design norms are super different even between these two topics. So I hope that you enjoy the first part of design accessibility for the handicapped. So as for a history of accessibility, unfortunately, the idea of handicap design is a relatively new movement, and it began after World War II. Several veterans who came home after fighting in the war faced physical challenges because of things like amputations or mine accidents or others, and many ended up appealing to congressional hearings in the 1950s for benefits that could help them to face these challenges, including things like specialized cars and houses. This support marked the beginning of what is called the barrier-free movement, which basically just recognizes the sort of obstacles that people with physical disabilities face. Early leaders in this field around the same time were actually university students who attended Cal Berkeley. Ed Roberts and John Hessler faced several physical difficulties, like the need for breathing devices at night and wheelchair transportation during the day. And so when they arrived at school in the 1960s, they actually had to live in a hospital at first, which basically just makes dorm complaints seem kind of trivial in comparison to their living experiences. But they ended up demanding changes in building design and suggested many of these changes themselves. This planted the seed of the independent living movement, which is an important term that's defined as recognizing that disabled people are the best experts on their needs, and it basically encourages them to design and promote what they see as best. And along with the independent living movement was the 1960s civil rights movement, which served to influence the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968. And this removes a significant employment obstacle, which is the physical design of buildings. And you can just think about all the different things like staircases and doorways, things like that, that would prevent people from being able to work in the same place as others. Despite the progress of the 60s, there was still much work to be done, and one such example was Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which did not fully address some of the related rights mentioned on the previous slide, like employment accessibility, things like that. And so, another leader in the field, Kitty Cohn, who was born with muscular dystrophy and therefore always needing wheelchair accessibility, things like that, she actually was an organizer of a government sit-in which protested some of these regulations. And just to read a quote by Kitty Cohn that I thought was interesting and revealing, she said, "Disability really was looked at as an issue of civil rights rather than an issue of charity, and rehabilitation at best, pity at worst." And I think it kind of encompasses a lot of the kind of public opinion towards the disabled, maybe even now. Just maybe seeing their needs as kind of pitiful, but not necessarily something that's actually an issue of civil rights. And so, as a leader in this field, Kitty Cohn really pushed back on that kind of mindset. And then a kind of response to this sit-in the 90s was the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, which ensured the equal treatment and access of people with disabilities. And finally, eventually, 2002, there's a push for universal design, which just sought to serve both the disabled and the non-disabled without compromise, and this will be addressed in later slides on design barriers. Alright, now for the fun part. So, to teach you guys about design norms, I'm going to take you through a pretend day in the life of someone who's handicapped and the sort of designs that help them to live what we would consider normally, or at least with fewer obstacles. So, here we go. So if you can imagine you just woke up for the day, some of the first concerns you might face are things like bed height, transferring from bed to the wheelchair, and so typically it's recommended in design norms that the bed height be slightly taller than the wheelchair height, which is about 19 inches. And then of course, once you're in the wheelchair, You would want the floors to be a smooth material like wood or laminate. If you think about other things you would do when you're getting ready for your day, like getting clothes out of cubbies or drawers, just that you would want to keep in mind things like weight and height, just because these people are limited to a certain eye level and also their nature that moves. So if drawers are super hard to open, that's probably also a little difficult to deal with. And in this sample blueprint, you can see that design also has to consider the space between walls in the bed and doorways and the height of even things like light switches and window height from the ground, just to make life easier. And then if you imagine you've gone into your bathroom to get ready for the day, maybe take a shower first, there's definitely a lot of safety issues that are concerns, especially because of water and space, things like that. But some of the physical designs that have to be considered are that tubs have to be walk-in and sinks need to be mounted on the wall with space underneath so that a person could wheel underneath, get closer, and that hooks and means for other accessories have to be within reach. And along with that, of course, there has to be space in the shower for turning, and especially if there's seats within the shower, they have to be around wheelchair height, and same with the height of toilets. And kitchens too have to consider some similar things like having counters that you can roll beneath and just having accessories that make kitchens easier to access. And there's a lot of cool new inventions these days for the handicap, just allowing them to have everything within arm's width. And of course, still keeping in mind things like room to turn and sink space beneath. And one thing I definitely didn't think about before was ovens, just because if you think about it, if they were actually low enough for someone in a wheelchair to be able to open and see inside, it could not be the typical swinging down type because it would end up just swinging right into their lap. And so for handicap design, ovens actually have to be side hinged. And one thing that I haven't mentioned for the other spaces of a house that I'm sure was probably obvious to you anyway, is just that the site itself, it's a lot easier for handicap houses to be one story, and sometimes, as we'll see later, there's ways to go around this, but for the most part, keeping the site one story is definitely helpful. This just makes it easier for transportation purposes too, or really anything you have to do around the house site, because for things like storage, for example, or recharging wheelchairs, or other kinds of mobility like scooters, and doing trash, recycling, all those need to be within places that can be wheeled to. And if you've ever seen the types of vehicles that can fit wheelchairs, usually vans, you'll see that they do need a lot of parking space, and it's probably beneficial for them to be indoors because the process of lowering ramps, it takes a while, especially in cases of bad weather. And so, just as an overview of living space, there's just always things to keep in mind, like turning radius and trying to reduce awkward angles and turns that can be caused sometimes by furniture or even just the way that doors are set up. And doorways, too, as we've mentioned before, have to be a certain width. It's actually 32 inches wide for the standard wheelchair width. And there are some kind of doors that are easier to deal with if you're in a wheelchair, like pocket doors or barn doors or even no doors, just because if you think about how typical doors work, they open kind of at an angle and it's difficult to wheel away from that space while still holding onto the door and opening it. And then finally, it's just also recommended in design to replace doorknobs with lever handles because it's kind of hard to twist from the angle of sitting down instead of above. I don't know if you've ever tried that before. I can say for the purpose of this project I did, and it is not easy. So that's just kind of a final overall house space design norm. And if a handicapped person needs to take public transport, there are some things that have been added to buses and shuttles because of earlier rights movements. And so, typical ways of making transport easier are through the entry. There's usually a lift door, and they have to be a certain height once they actually have been lifted up, just so they have space to wheel in. And these lifts also have to be able to withstand a certain amount of weight just for safety reasons. And then once the wheelchair or scooter or other mobility device has been lifted up, there are safety seatbelt tie downs, which have to have at least 4 straps apparently for both lap and shoulder. And those just ensure that the transport won't move around during, braking or speeding up or turning. In our pretend day in the life example, we could say you went to work, and through that, there's a few other considerations, not only for work buildings, but most public spaces. And I'm sure you've seen these before: parking spaces close to the entrance, access ramps that aren't too steep, doors that are wide enough for wheelchair access, and elevator control panels that are low enough too. As with all design, there are disruptions, however, and so moving forward, we'll see what some of those are. As I briefly mentioned in history of design, the push for universal design was kind of a response to disagreements over the impractical nature of disability design, and particularly for the non disabled, because groups like hotels and businesses and transport, all of a sudden they had to design these features that perhaps had made them lose money. Like if you think about how many bus seats are lost through handicap positions, or the type of money that would need to be spent to create access ramps, that was certainly a cause of the pushback. And along with that also was accessibility regulations from the government, because not every federal or high up authority necessarily always cares about disabled rights, and so it really depends on who's in office as well. Optimistically, though, the future of handicap design does involve a lot of this idea of universal design, which just means there'll be less arguments over impractical designs that have to be made, because it'll be easier for handicapped people to use some of the same features that people who can just walk can. So, somewhat recently, this appeared on BBC Future's website, and I think it's pretty cool. It's a wheelchair that actually can go up and down stairs. And just a quote from their website: the chair allows disabled people to easily reach a location that previously would have been inaccessible, a game changing, retractable set of rubber tracks that allows the chair to maneuver up and down stairs. Another future design is wheelchair-friendly cars, which Trend Hunter says would be around 3.5 inches off the ground for easy entry. And that would also be a great innovation, particularly for transportation. And then finally, another design that, as I mentioned before, would be great for houses that are not one story for the handicapped are indoor lifts. And these are basically the equivalent of a mini elevator that can go inside of the home, and they're big enough for wheelchairs. And as the Stilts Trio Home elevator website suggests, this home design feature enables wheelchair users to take back control of their lives by enabling them to live independently at home. And that really follows along the line of, as we discussed earlier, the independent living movement. And in summary, I hope that you learned, as I have, more about the challenges that the handicapped face and the resilience that they've had to go through, not only in history but in the present, and also just the cool inventions and design considerations that better allow the handicapped to deal with daily obstacles. And so, thank you for listening.